I've spent a lot of time snorkeling in this quiet little lake, and the fish that I see most often are the bluegill. These friendly little fish are usually the first ones to greet me when I enter the water, so I've spent a lot of time admiring them, and I've already made a couple videos about bluegills that feature them in their natural habitat. But I've never seriously considered keeping bluegill in an aquarium until it was suggested by one of my viewers. I was reluctant at first because bluegill can get fairly large and they're not a very colorful fish. But this viewer's persistence, his generosity, and his love of these native fish finally convinced me to give them a try. His view was that bluegill more than make up for their lack of color with their outgoing personalities and interactive behavior. So I thought I'd give these underappreciated fish a closer look and set up an aquarium just for them. But there's one problem. I can't legally take any fish from this lake and put it in an aquarium without a special collection permit. However, oddly enough, it's perfectly legal for me to catch, kill, and eat as many bluegill as I want because there are no restrictions at all on the number of these fish that I can harvest. But should I decide to capture a fish and keep it alive in an aquarium, I'd be breaking the law, and they'd have me behind bars before the day was done. Now, I'm just kidding, of course. Many people keep native fish that they caught in a local body of water, and Johnny Law doesn't come knocking down their doors to confiscate the fish and arrest the perpetrators. But the Dave doesn't need any hassles with the fuzz, the 5-0, or the man, so all of the captive bluegill that you're about to see have been obtained legally. And if you're interested in purchasing native fish for your aquarium, there are several online retailers that sell many different species of native fish. Nonetheless, before getting my bluegills, I set up a 55-gallon tank and let it mature for a little over 3 months before adding the fish. I added some seasoned driftwood, some pool filter sand, and a small number of live plants. Floating at the surface are redroot floaters, while planted in the substrate I have jungle vallisneria along the back and dwarf sagittaria planted along the front. There's also some African water ferns attached to the driftwood as well. It's a simple setup, and once the plants start to grow and spread out, everything should fill in nicely. The aquarium is filtered using 2 mature sponge filters that I took from a fully cycled tank. I also added a background to the tank in order to hide the blue wall in back of the aquarium, as well as to hide the cords and the airline tubing. And as I said earlier, the tank ran like this for 3 months before I added any fish. I started with 7 juvenile bluegill, but my long-term goal is to end up with only 1 adult fish. However, keeping them in a small group initially will help them feel more at ease in their new home because they'll be in the company of other bluegills. And you know the old saying, there's safety in numbers. But the plan is to slowly remove them one by one until I'm left with a single bluegill that I hope will be very tame and interactive. Until then, I have to keep a close eye on them because bluegill can be very aggressive at times, so keeping them in a group might mean trouble. And as you can see, we already have a tank bully who insists that he's the boss. The bluegill are growing quickly. Unfortunately, so is the cyanobacteria along the back of the tank. I could treat it with an antibiotic, but I've decided to wait and see if I can fix it naturally by increasing the water movement. I try to avoid chemical treatments whenever possible. Either way, the cyanobacteria isn't harmful to the fish, so for now I'm willing to live with it. Nonetheless, the largest fish is now 2.5 inches in length, and the smallest is somewhere close to 1.5 inches long. They're all very friendly fish and not the least bit shy. Now, some of you may have noticed that the largest fish has several white thread-like things hanging from its vent. When I first saw this, I was worried that it might be an internal parasite called the camelonus worm, but a closer inspection showed me that it was just some undigested plant matter, so that was a relief. Wild-caught fish are often host to all sorts of internal as well as external parasites. So just as a precaution, it would have been a good idea for me to treat these bluegill with a course of anti-parasitic medications when they first arrived. However, I chose not to do that, so I'm taking a bit of a risk with these fish because they could be carrying all sorts of parasites or disease that might get into my other aquariums. So as a precaution, the bluegill tank has its own set of nets, buckets, and hoses that don't get used in any of my other aquariums, so it's very unlikely that there'll be any cross-contamination between the tanks. Luckily, at this point, I haven't had any problems with parasites or disease in any of these fish, so the main issue with this tank right now is the growth of cyanobacteria. This ancient form of life is sometimes referred to as blue-green algae, but it is in fact a very special type of photosynthetic bacteria that is thought to be responsible for producing most of the oxygen during the early evolution of life on Earth. So we may in fact owe our very existence to the oxygen produced by early forms of cyanobacteria. However, in the aquarium, these little wonders of evolution are a bit of an eyesore. Now, one of the ways to inhibit the growth of cyanobacteria is to increase the water movement. So I've removed the floating plants, added an air stone, and cranked up the air going to the sponge filters. I also manually remove as much of it as I can every time I do a water change, and I've been very careful with the amount of food going into this tank as well, because an excessive amount of nutrients can contribute to the growth of cyanobacteria. Apparently, high phosphate levels can cause outbreaks too, but I haven't tested for that. All of my other water parameters are fine, so I really don't think that it's a water quality issue. Nonetheless, another approach that's often recommended is to completely block any light from entering the tank for several days. But I've never tried that, so I can't say how effective it'll be. But I do know that if the root cause of the problem is not taken care of, then it'll just keep coming back. Perhaps the most effective way to deal with an outbreak of cyanobacteria is to treat the tank with an antibiotic called erythromycin. But for now, I'm holding off on using antibiotics, preferring instead to use a much more difficult, time-consuming, and labor-intensive approach that will probably fail miserably. Luckily, the fish are doing just fine and don't seem to be bothered by the cyanobacteria at all. Nonetheless, bluegills are a lot like cichlids, both in their appearance and their behaviors, even though they're not related to each other. And these similarities are due to something called convergent evolution, which is where two completely unrelated groups of organisms independently evolve very similar physical traits and behaviors. These similarities are caused when both groups live in similar types of habitats, which cause them to adapt and evolve in similar ways. And the end result is you get two animals or two groups of animals that are very much alike, but they're unrelated. And that's the way it is with the cichlids and members of the sunfish family, such as the bluegill, pumpkinseed, largemouth bass, and smallmouth bass, because they're the North American equivalents of the cichlids that we see in South America and Africa. And one of the really cool things about both cichlids and sunfish is that both families of fish tend to be very intelligent and have complex social behaviors. So I'm hoping that in time these fish will come to know me, trust me, and then interact with me in ways that you wouldn't expect from a fish. And when it's all said and done, I might end up with a pet bluegill that becomes more like a good friend than a pet fish. Now, that might be a bit too much to ask, but I think it's worth a try, because who wouldn't want to become friends with a fish?